Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 28. One of the big decisions a developer has to make is when they sit down to code, what tool do they want to use? Would you like a tool that understands Python and is there to help with suggestions, definitions, and analysis of your code? Many of the developers that I've been working with have been turning to the free tool from Microsoft called Visual Studio Code. This week on the show, we have Savannah Ostrowski, Program Manager for the Python language server and Python in Visual Studio. We discuss Pylance, a new language server with fast feature-rich language support inside of Visual Studio Code. Savannah explains what a language server is and the types of features it can provide. This includes type information, code completion, automatic imports, dead code analysis, and more. We also have a discussion about type checking in Python, which leads to how Pylance leverages the static type checking tool Pyright. And what are type stubs, those .pyi files you might have seen. Okay, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Savannah, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Christopher. Thanks for the invite.
I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit about what you're doing at Microsoft and kind of the team that you're working with.
Yeah, totally. So I joined actually fairly recently in January. Wow. I don't even know what month it is anymore, to be honest. It's like kind of old.
Thanks, coronavirus.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, so I joined back in January. I actually joined as a program manager, and before that I was working as a software engineer. So this is like my first foray into the program management role, which is kind of exciting and super exciting to be on a team that's like really technical and really deep in like the Python space. And so I joined as the program manager for the Python language server and Python in Visual Studio.
Yeah.
And I've kind of just been working on Pylance in secret for a couple months and then in the open since the end of June.
Yeah. That's one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you. A handful of people at Real Python asking me questions about Pylance, and we're excited about it. And then I mentioned it to Russell Keith McGee, the guy who creates Beware and Briefcase and so forth. And I had mentioned that I was, interested in talking to you, and he's like, "Oh, I would listen to that episode." So I was
no
like,
pressure.
"All right." Exactly. So yeah, there's some people that are very interested in this subject. Maybe we could just do a quick background of like you working with Python.
Yeah. So it's actually kind of funny. So I come from like a non-traditional computer science background in like a mixture of like technical geography and computer science. So like think satellite imagery and whatnot.
Oh, cool.
And so Python was actually like my first programming language, like 7 or 8 years ago now. Very like basic scripting. And then since then, I've kind of been working like on and off with Python, kind of doing like everything from like data engineering to like full stack development, like Flask and kind of like React type apps. So yeah, so I've kind of been all over the place with Python.
I got a chance to interview Armin Ronacher about Flask. It was a fun conversation, talking about the history of it and kind of his involvement with the project. And it's been fun talking to people that are involved in these projects and these things that are kind of building up. And I'm really intrigued by what Microsoft is doing in this sort of developer space, and especially Python, creating all these tools. So you said you just recently started. You started in January in this particular role. Were you doing other roles at Microsoft before that?
No. So I was an external hire to Microsoft in January. This is my first role at Microsoft, actually.
Okay. I guess maybe we could talk about the origins of the project. Were you initially working on the Visual Studio team or the Visual Studio Code team?
So it's kind of interesting. So I joined up for the Python language server team, and then Python and Visual Studio as kind of like, it's like part of my main role. But my focus has been primarily on the language server since I've joined. But
yeah,
the language server is kind of like, and we can get into this. I'm sure you have questions about the LSP and stuff. But
oh yeah,
it's like a kind of client agnostic type piece of software. So I partner with a lot of teams, like right now, very closely with Visual Studio Code and that team. But there's, plans for Pylance to be incorporated into other products in the future. So other Azure offerings. So it's kind of like a very collaborative role in that way.
Yeah, you get to work across a lot of different groups, probably getting a lot of feedback.
Yeah, it's actually like really interesting too, because we have the Python team at Microsoft has grown a lot. And so we have like a lot of PMs that have very like discrete focus on like things like they focus on data science, Python stuff. Whereas Pylance is very much like this overarching, like I have users that are like, people brand new to using Python that have like, this is their first programming language all the way up to like, or I'm a machine learning engineer, or I do full stack web development, or so like the users that I have to consider are really broad, which I think is like one of the most fun parts of working on Pylance is like, how do we make this approachable for everyone?
Yeah, that I think is so crucial because that's one of the kind of ongoing conversations that I have with everybody, me being myself, fairly new to Python and wanting to learn through teaching and doing this podcast to do the same kind of thing to kind of break things down and explain them. I think that's always a great direction to kind of come from, is to always sort of look at like, okay, well, how are people going to use this? And, from, those beginning developers all the way to the advanced ones. So
totally. And I feel like any way that like we can make a product like makes Python more approachable, especially like when you're first starting to learn how to code or like learning Python. I feel like there's already so many things that are like overwhelming and like, that you have to kind of grapple with. It's like, finding like the wins for like our new developers, I think is like something that's really, I don't know, empowering for me.
Yeah, totally. I guess we could dive right in then and just say, my first question is, okay, when I heard the term a language server, my head kind of spun a little bit. I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, what is a language server in that terminology?
Yeah. So you're not alone. I was also new to the concept of a language server when I started at Microsoft. And so like the way I like to think of a language server is kind of like a provider of like all the bells and whistles of what I would consider a good developer experience for Python. So kind of like everything from like completions to signature help and doc strings and code navigation, errors and warnings in your code. So like a language server is really just like a piece of software that is written in like a client agnostic kind of way, in that it doesn't care what editor IDE you're using. But like, well, specifically, like we're using a language server that abides by the language server protocol. So that makes it like easy to kind of plug and play into different editors and IDEs, so long as they also communicate under that protocol.
So that part's kind of new. The idea of making a language server have a protocol so that it can work across the landscape. That's kind of a newer development.
Microsoft has been working on that for a couple years now. I think like historically, like people who were developing tools that were in the language server flavor were, writing support for Python for a specific editor IDE. But now, like with the language server protocol, that standardizes how servers and development tools can communicate. And so it's kind of like a win for people who are both working on like these providers, but also like the tooling vendors, because it means that you can just write one application and have that kind of plug into whatever editor.
Obviously, it's something that you can add to VSCode pretty easily. What are other IDEs that it could be used with?
So for Pylance is specifically made for Microsoft products.
Okay.
But for like, if you were writing like your own language server, you could, use the LSP, the language server protocol, and create a language server that could be used in something like, I don't know, Sublime or like VI or something like, or with Vim or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily tied to like a Microsoft product. It's like you're creating it so that you could, I guess it's kind of like, in my opinion, kind of like productizing your language server. So it's kind of like, it stands alone, but it can be used with a lot of other things.
Right. So it's kind of maybe hopefully expanding the footprint of it and getting more users on board it.
Totally.
So before Pylance, were there other tools that were using the language server protocol?
Our original language server offering, the Microsoft Python language server, abided by the language server protocol largely. There were areas that it did not. But with Pylance, we've been really trying to make it totally LSP compliant to save us headaches later.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So to kind of go back a little bit to talk about the things that it serves or provides, you kind of
Yeah.
listed off a bit of a laundry list of those things. Can we go back over them one by one a little bit?
Yeah, totally. This is I'm glad you're asking that, because I feel like when I mentioned that I work on a language server, people are like, so what is that? And I list out a million things. They're like, but I get those without Pylance. Like, why is Pylance special?
Yeah, sure.
So Pylance provides things like completions, or some people call them auto completions. So if you're like typing and you hit dot and you get the list of potential functions or variables that you could use, that's something that Pylance provides. Also signature help. So that's kind of like while you're typing, Pylance has the ability to kind of help, in my opinion, kind of help you write code a little easier, because it basically provides you with the signature and a tooltip so that you know what parameters the function is expecting. And it also handles functions where there's like multiple overloads on that function. So you can kind of toggle that tooltip.
Yeah, I was looking at your video demonstration of that, and it kind of intrigued me because overloading is, kind of a bit of an advanced topic for, somebody who's like, getting into Python and learning just object-oriented stuff right away. And so I was like, oh, that's really kind of funky that it allows you to see all the different, like there was like literally like a 1, 2, 3 up and down arrow of the different things that this, function could have been overloaded to handle these different types. And I'm guessing that's through, does that require annotations for that to work?
The way that works is kind of like if you have, so you don't need to have like annotations or stubs to get that. It's basically like if you've created a function that has an overload, we basically can find that information and then provide it to you in the tooltip. And the one thing that's kind of interesting about the signature help is that, you're able to like manually kind of toggle between them. To your point about like, if you're a new Python developer, you may not understand why we're showing you multiple.
Right.
Like something that I think is pretty cool is that we have the ability to kind of like, so let's say you're invoking a function that has multiple overloads and you've typed the first parameter and you have an overload for that function that actually takes in 2 parameters. As soon as you start typing the second parameter, we're just going to switch over to the other signature for you. So we kind of like keep track of where you're at and infer like what signature is applicable to the function that you're trying to invoke.
Like which path you're traveling down.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't necessarily have to manually like click through to find the one that's like applicable to what you're trying to do. Like we do that for you. And we also keep track of like named params as well. So that's something that I think I was really excited about when we were able to ship that in Pylance.
Yeah, that stuff looks really cool. I think that the way the definitions sort of show up is different. Like that layout looked really different to me. Mm-hmm. How it's kind of like a split window.
Are you talking about the
like when it's providing hints and then providing the, I'm going to say the wrong word, but the descriptions of the functions to the right of it, and then of all the arguments and everything, kind of like almost kind of formatted like a code formatter.
Yeah.
Whereas it's different.
Yeah. So the difference is that we have docs. So what you're so the top part of that tooltip, if you're invoking a function and you get completions and you see on the right hand side the bigger tooltip, we prioritize the signature in that tooltip.
Okay.
And I think the difference that we're also trying to figure out the best, if there's additional improvements we want to make here for readability, especially for kind of beefier functions. But like we show the types of each parameter in the signature, which if you don't use types in Python, maybe you don't care about, but I still think that it's kind of valuable, especially if you're like, I don't know, invoking something like read CSV from pandas and there's like 50 parameters that it could possibly take in. You're like, which one is this? So
that's a huge one.
That's like the best example. So we have the signature at the top with the types, the parameter types and the return type. And then if possible, we get the doc string. So that's kind of like the general like hierarchy that we have now, but definitely open to user feedback if there's ways that people think that the readability there could be improved.
Yeah. So that kind of covered 2 things, like the code hints for like when you're hitting dot and getting the code completion, and then you're getting the doc strings and the types of parameters and so forth that it can accept. If we kind of continue on the list, what else was there?
Yeah, so we also have like all the code nav stuff. So like go to definition is something Pylance handles. right now we show you both the definition of that function, but we can also show you the signature in the type stub, which is something that is interesting if you're into types in Python. And then also diagnostics. So that's, any error or warning that appears in your code. We have different levels of diagnostics that we can provide depending on the type checking mode that you select.
Okay.
So by default, type checking is off, as types are kind of this newish construct in Python. So by default, you're going to get errors and warnings for things like unresolved variables or unresolved imports. And then if you enable basic mode, you're going to get, basic set of type checking rules. And then strict mode, you're going to get even more type checking rules at the highest level of severity. So they're going to appear as errors.
Yeah. So that brings me to want to ask a little more about type checking. And if you could, just to talk a little bit about the different ways that the types can be sort of defined in your Python files.
There's like a couple different approaches, right? There's like, actually annotating your code.
Right.
But then you also have things like type stubs, which act as separate files, that are what I kind of describe as pseudo Python, because it's, just function signatures and return types. And
yeah, those are really funky. Like that's something I wasn't that familiar with.
Yeah.
And, these .pyi files, I guess kind of introduced with PEP 561.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can kind of reference that, but it, like you're saying, they're almost like just the definitions, these kinds of things that, a tool like Pylance would really love to have to be able to provide you more information about the code that you're writing. So these kind of sit alongside your other files. From what I'm reading and trying to do my research, it looks like, it would read that .pyi file first before it goes into the .py file. And inside of it, it would have, the same way you start off, you're defining your function, but then you would have the annotations right there with it, with the return value, the little sort of pseudo arrow and the return type, and then a ... basically saying, implemented somewhere else,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that really intrigues me. And I'm always like, okay, well, I really want to see some examples of these things. And I was, kind of stumped then, because I kind of started my research a little late to get into this conversation. And I'm like, okay, well, what are examples of that in the wild? Like where can I find these .pyi files and being used and just to kind of get like a good example of what's happening. I don't know if you have a good example.
Yeah. So Pylance is shipped with a bundle of type stubs for popular modules.
Oh, okay.
From a repository, an open source repo called Typeshed.
Okay.
And so you can go into Typeshed, and Typeshed you can see PYI files for some, mostly Python 3, but also some Python 2 modules, which is kind of interesting. And we also, if you're interested, Pylance also has the ability to provide you with code actions. So if you're in the strictest type checking mode, there's actually a code action that you can generate your own type stub from. It's really bare bones, and there's definitely some manual intervention needed to get it to be totally accurate. But if you're just looking for a skeleton of what that structure looks like, I think that those are two resources you could check out.
Okay.
I think there's also some good documentation somewhere. I can't remember what website. There was some tutorial on writing type stubs that was pretty interesting.
Cool.
That I'd seen recently.
I'll have to have you help me find that.
Yeah.
And we'll put it in the show notes. That sounds good. Yeah. So so you're saying that Pylance can potentially help you create a mock-up, if you will, of a .pyi file that you could then continue to fill in yourself with more types?
Yeah. So Pylance uses this static type checking tool that was written at Microsoft called Pyright. And so Pyright is what Pylance uses under the hood for the foundation of its analysis. And by inheritance, we get some really cool features like code actions for generating type stubs. But that only shows up if you're in the strictest type checking mode, because we are pretty cognizant that, your average Python developer who's just trying to script probably doesn't care about generating type stubs.
Sure.
But yeah, so that will produce a very bare bones skeleton of the file structure for you. But in all honesty, the type part, you're probably going to have to do quite a bit of handling to get to the level of quality where you would probably be happy with it.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's a good like starting point for sure.
Yeah, I love the name of Pyright, by the way.
I mean, it's like the best.
I thought that was
I'm
funny.
jealous that,
yeah, and then the symbol of it being a big rock, and I'm like, oh gosh. I used to live in Arizona, and so when I was really young, we'd go out to like these, the Western town and do like the whole thing where you like pan for gold and and it was so funny. And of course, you'd find the fool's gold of Pyright.
Yeah.
So it was kind of silly.
Yeah. It was we tried to find a name for Pylance that was a little bit like in the same vein as Pyright, because Pyright is like, such an integral part of Pylance, but
yeah,
I'm still happy with what we came up with.
No, Pylance is amazing, and it fits Python perfectly with the whole Monty Python kind of range there also. So
well, thanks. It was definitely like a thing my team spun wheels on for a while.
Cool. Okay, so I did a tutorial on type checking. It's just going to sound like a recurring theme to my listeners, me talking about it, but I'm very intrigued in it because it was one of those things that I got stuck on as a beginner in Python, where I would see the types sort of written in the code, and I was like, this stuff doesn't seem to do anything. What is this? And it was intriguing to me, and so I wanted to learn more about it. And so I learned about the tool of Mypy and kind of how it works. But Pyright is kind of coming at it from a bit of a different angle, especially with how it handles the stub files. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, Pyright and Mypy, like, they're both type checkers.
Yeah.
Pyright is a little different in that, like, Pyright is really fast, and Pyright and Mypy differ, I think, largely in like the kinds of rules that they have that they use for type checking. So, like, they have their own set of rules. They are different. There's probably overlap. I'm no Mypy expert by any means.
Sure, that's okay.
But, I think like the beauty of Pyright is that it's just like so configurable. You can really customize like, and Pylance by extension gets, all of this, but it allows you to like totally customize the diagnostics that are surfaced in your workspace. So that's like, if you want to suppress a type of rule that produces errors and warnings, you have that's your prerogative. You can totally do that.
Okay.
You can also set like the severity to be totally different. We support like error, warning, informational, and off levels. So that's, I think, kind of cool. And then also Pyright supports like this notion of kind of like different execution environments. So you could have like a configuration file that tells Pyright and Pylance that you want to, each environment specifies like a different Python version, for instance. You could totally do that, or different platform targets. And so I think like in the customizability, I think that's kind of like what makes Pyright so flexible. It's like, and I think, every developer has like their own setup and customizations that they want.
Right.
So I think like that's, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine that's huge in the sense that Python, at least in the recent versions, and obviously organizations are going to be across multiple versions and upgrading code and so forth, but a lot of the annotations and the type checking and enhancements, from Python 3.8 and now Python 3.9 are in this area, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, okay, cool. So that was kind of like our dive into Pyright. And
yeah, that just happened.
No, it's cool. I think what's important is you're getting a lot of the functionality for Pylance through that, right?
Yeah.
It's helping to inform how Pylance is responding to the user's input as they're, typing along.
Yeah. Yeah.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It covers a topic we touch on during this week's episode, and I've actually mentioned several times over the past few weeks. It's titled Python Type Checking. The course is based on an article by Real Python author and guest on episode number 1, Gerarn Jelle. This is one of my courses, and I take you through what are type annotations and type hints, how to add static types to your code and the code of others, how to run a static type checker, in this case we use Mypy, and how to enforce types at runtime. I think it's a worthy investment of your time to learn about type checking in Python. Whether you're looking at source code of a library you've imported or trying to document your own code, it can help you and others understand the intent of the code. And it'll also make your code work better with tools like Pylance. Like most of the video courses on Real Python, this course is broken into easily consumable sections, and you get code examples for the techniques shown. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. So we covered, a couple things kind of initially as far as the functionalities that it's providing. One of the ones that I noticed that was really kind of interesting was this idea of auto imports. How's that working?
Yeah, so that's a feature that has been asked for a very long time. It is also a very contentious feature. I feel like it's very polarizing. You either really love it or you are not into it at all. So auto imports so let's imagine that you're writing code and you try to invoke functionality from some module that you've installed in your virtual environment, but you haven't imported it in the file yet.
Okay.
So auto imports adds entries to the list of completions that you will get when you start typing out pandas, even if you haven't imported it yet, to basically allow you to import it by selecting from that list. So you don't have to go to the top of your file and manually type import pandas. We do that for you, so you can just keep writing code in place. And the reason I say I mentioned that's contentious because I want everyone listening to know that you can turn it off if you really hate it. I'm not going to force you to use it, so okay. you can disable it. But by default, we actually do. It isn't turned on for everyone.
I had an experience. I was playing with it. I was creating a simple Flask app, and as I'm typing along, I had initially just imported some basic parts of Flask. And then as I was typing out something and I capitalized response. And so it went and grabbed that for me, right? It grabbed, and actually I was it was a typo on my part, but it was just kind of funny how it was very eager.
Yeah.
And I think that might be part of the contentiousness that you're feeling there.
Yeah. Basically what you're describing is exactly why users tell us that they aren't into it.
Okay.
And without revealing too much, we've been, this is a feature that there's changes to be made in the near-ish future.
Sure.
To make it a little bit more flexible, and make the experience a little bit better.
Okay.
But yes, it is extremely eager. And I think part of it from a user experience perspective is that I think that if you're not used to it, then you might accidentally click something or select something from the list of completions that auto imports. And then you are very confused because you go to the top of your file and you notice, oh, I didn't import that. How did that end up there?
Yeah. It's it's kind of interesting. So that's just to modify those kinds of things, it would be under settings.
Yes, you can change it in your settings JSON if you want to turn it off.
Okay.
And the documentation for all of our settings is in our GitHub repo, which we use for issue tracking and documentation. So you can get it there, or you can check out the settings in VSCode proper. If you just click on the Pylance extension, we have those all listed. And also you can get it we recently added full completion support in your settings JSON. So if you start typing something like completions, you will get that for you. So you don't even have to look it up. So that's awesome. I forgot about that.
Cool. All right. Auto completions for your settings. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many in VSCode. So
yeah, no, it's
anything to make it easier.
Yeah, no, totally. It's very deep as far as the setting screens. It's multiple indexings and layers. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So what are the other ones on the list that we were kind of going through if we kind of keep going down the additional things that it's providing? Yeah.
So the last one right now is code actions. And so this is it's not the last one, but there's many. But I think the last biggie is we have code actions enabled for imports. So that's if you try and invoke a function from a module that you have not yet imported, similarly to auto imports, you can see a little light bulb appear that will allow you to right-click that light bulb and you can select the import and it will add to the top of the line. So that's a little bit more manual, and people who usually don't like auto imports much prefer the add import code actions.
Okay.
And then also we have one that will detect if the import is not being used and will tell you, have a light bulb to ask you to suggest that you can remove it. And that also pairs nicely with the other feature that I wanted to mention, which is the dead code analysis feature, which will flag chunks of code that are not going to be executed or variables that aren't used.
Okay. So it kind of does a sort of preemptive scan of your code and kind of can see something that's not going to be run.
Yeah. So there's like some code flow analysis that happens. And basically what happens is it will gray out the area that is not going to be run. So I think that's like kind of nice, especially if you're working on like really big code bases and you've been working on like refactoring or, resolving bugs and stuff, that you can catch that kind of stuff. I know that I've worked in code bases where we've refactored and then there's like dead code and we know it, but we don't know where it lives.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Like you would have to reduce multiple functions down into like one or something like that.
Yeah.
Now these things are never called.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I was looking at, as you were posting recently about updates to VSCode, and I don't know how involved you are in some of the features being added to VSCode also. Is that part of your role?
No. I focus largely on Pylance. Sometimes that means that I work with the VSCode team to make things happen, but largely like we're all in the Python realm.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess if there are additional Python features, and the one I'm thinking of is the interactive windows.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is that something you're involved with?
I am not.
Okay.
Other PMs on my team, we've kind of divided up the Python like workload. And so there's like, there's a data science, there's 2 data science PMs for VSCode and Python and VSCode. And then there's a PM that owns the extension, Python extension all up. And then there's me. So,
okay.
Yeah. So it's very much divided.
That makes sense.
But we all like anything Python VSCode, like I know a person that can make something happen. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just thought that was an interesting feature, that sort of notebook kind of like functionality of the interactive windows. I thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah. So Pylance works with Jupyter notebooks and VS Code, which is something I think the functionality is a subset of all Python functionality. Some of the functionality for Pylance doesn't necessarily make sense for people using notebooks. But yeah, that poses that using an IPyMB file was definitely something that my team worked on, trying to make sure that Pylance, like actually all the right features were lighting up, because the structure of the file, as you can imagine, is quite different than like Py files.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. And having worked in Jupyter notebooks, and being frustrated to not have any form of like completion and other things like that, where it would just be, or, eventually it might slowly give you some, hints and some additional things inside of it. I'm excited to try that out.
Yeah. So the big ones there that are lit up for Jupyter in VS Code are completions, tooltips on completion. So that's like the signature help and doc strings, and then symbol hover. So if you hovered on a function, you could see the signature. But then the things that don't necessarily work are like go to definition.
Yeah, I was thinking that, like, because what it would normally do is open that other file for you, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Okay. So yeah, so I was thinking about that, like, that's one big advantage of having that, is that, you can kind of track down, like, okay, if you did get an error, or you're having to do some other kind of trace back kind of thing, it really assists in that whole process of doing the actual tracing back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. One of the things that I think is mentioned in there is the ability to work across multiple workspaces. And I kind of was intrigued by that. And I don't know, I played with it for the first time with like a Raspberry Pi, and I was doing some experimentation with that. And I was, using on my Mac to connect to it remotely, which was pretty cool. And I can imagine in like these sort of serverless and other kinds of architectures in Docker and so forth, this idea of like being able to access these other remote workspaces. I don't know if you can kind of give a little background on that and how Pylance kind of can work with those.
Yeah. So multi-root workspaces was something new to me coming to work on my team. I didn't even know VS Code could do this when I started, but I think it's pretty cool. So let's imagine that you work on multiple projects and they're either related or I don't know, you want to see both of them in the same kind of like window. So VS Code has this construct of like multi-root workspaces, which means basically Why this is special for Pylance is that Pylance will let you run multiple instances of the language server, one for each root in your workspace.
Okay.
Which means that you could have like your own configuration, your own settings JSON in each folder, and the language server would use that like discretely, like on its own. So you could like, let's say one of your projects had types in Python, so you wanted our strict type checking mode enabled, where the other one maybe you don't. You could totally do that in a multi-root workspace. So I think that's kind of like the beauty of it, and this is something that the Microsoft Python language server didn't really do very well, and something that we were not really able to get working for this. So I think that's like largely the gist of it. I don't know. I'm actually not like a huge user of this feature, but I think that like the potential is really interesting.
Yeah, I guess, again, having, maybe it goes back to that idea of like the multiple potential code bases and the versions and so forth that they might be based upon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The one other thing is that you can have you could have like a configuration file in each root, and you can also have one at the top level if there are settings that apply to all the roots. And so like there's a prioritization structure of like, oh, I prioritize what's in my file and then what's at like the, we ingest that and like conflate them all together so that you can actually have settings stored in multiple places, and it all works really nicely.
One of the questions I have that I guess slightly off topic, but like, why do you like to make developer tools? Like, why did you get into this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I mentioned before, I used to be a software engineer, and I kind of like fell into the world of software engineering. And then at some point kind of like realized that I wanted to work as a program manager in product, because I was really interested in kind of like the why of like why we should build something, or like, what do users really want? And so I think like for me now working as a program manager on the language server, it's like really exciting to me to work on like figuring out the why for like this, this developer tool. Cause like I was and am an end user of this product. So I feel like it's totally easy to like empathize and relate and get like super excited about the functionality that we're lighting up, because I don't know, as an end user, I would be really excited. And also I feel like, when I hear, if I'm interviewing a customer or a user of the product and I hear them say like, this made my life so much easier, I feel like that's like the most rewarding thing, especially because like developer tools are like all about productivity.
Yeah.
And like, how can we get you writing your best code like the fastest, or like, how can we make all the pain points you have be less painful? I don't know. I feel like that's like really, I don't know, it's very empowering. And I feel like it's all worth it when I hear someone say like, oh, Pylance made me so much more productive or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's just really rewarding and really relatable for me.
What kinds of things, like, I don't know if you can give like a concrete example of somebody, like some usage that they had that it improved on. I
think like the big one, and this is kind of like coming down to like, I think, we've really emphasized that Pylance is really performant. And, we've seen, old or existing Microsoft Python language server users say that like, they are seeing their project, like when they go to open a project, it used to take them like 10 minutes to have, MPLS or some other product index their files, and like before they could actually start writing code.
Yeah.
But with Pylance, we don't really do any upfront analysis. So there's no indexing and there's no waiting. So now they're like, oh, like I went from 10 minutes down to like 5 seconds.
Wow.
And I think like that for me, like, I don't know, that's something that I always like really griped about in other like products that I had used when I was writing Python. Because I know that there are some users that don't care about like the bells and whistles. They're like, give me Vim and I'm happy.
Right.
But I was never that user. I definitely appreciated like go to definition and like completions and stuff. And like, I feel like there's nothing worse than like having to wait to try and get what you want to get done. I feel like developers are very like action focused. So it's like, how can I get from A to B like as fast as possible? I don't want to I don't want to leave and go read things for like 10 minutes to try and figure out, oh, this isn't working, or, how can we keep people writing code without getting them distracted, or like, how can we make them do that as quickly as possible?
Yeah. Maybe that kind of goes back to something that we touched on initially, which was like, how does it help like that beginner person? How does it help them code?
Yeah. So I think like the beauty of Pylance is that, like I mentioned, for like some functions, I think like a lot of when I first started programming, like a lot of my gripes were like, okay, I need to use this function, but I don't know what to like pass into it. I don't know what it takes. And I think like we do a pretty good job of surfacing like the signature help, like, oh, like you need to pass in a file here, or you need to pass in like a string. And I think that's kind of helpful because it like doesn't make users have to go read documentation to figure out what they're trying to accomplish. And then the other thing is that we also work with IntelliCode,
Okay.
which is something that some users are really into, especially when they're getting started. IntelliCode basically takes the Pylance completion suggestions and prioritizes it based on your context using machine learning. And so we're totally compatible with that as well, which I think, I feel like the thing here that I'm really interested in is trying to get like the Python and VS Code to be like this comprehensive suite of tooling so that you can like come here and like just do things fast. And I think that's like where a lot of my focus has been in the last little while. And yeah, so I think like that's definitely something that's helpful for new Python users.
Yeah, I think that's cool. Like I use tools like that in my trainings, in the video tutorials that I use a REPL tool called Python, and it does a lot of that, suggestions and showing the definitions and so forth. But it excites me that, now with these types of tools that I can actually almost do it all inside of, without having to open up anything kind of separate. It's going to give me a lot of that, the definitions and everything in the doc strings and all that stuff right there. And again, the idea of like not having to go look up something, having it kind of like brought to you, I think is so crucial. Is IntelliCode like a separate install at that point then?
Yeah.
A separate add-on?
Yeah. So you would so Pylance works like, so you have to have the Python extension installed to use Pylance in VS Code. They're like sister products. We work very closely together. And then IntelliCode is a separate installation. Also, you can get that from the marketplace. And IntelliCode actually works with other languages too. It's not just Python. It's kind of a cool thing to try out if you're, trying to. I thought it was pretty neat that they could prioritize based on context or like, not just, frequency of use or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I have a couple weekly questions that I like to ask everybody. And the first one goes into, something that you're excited about in the world of Python. And that could be like an event or a tool or a book or something happening in the world of Python that you personally are excited about right now.
Yeah. So one, more Pylance goodness coming into the world. And
okay.
So that's like a shameless plug. And then two,
that's okay.
I'm into it. I'm here for it, I guess. And then the other is just like in-person conferences.
Sure.
like I have never attended PyCon US, and I was supposed to go this year, and it obviously got, digital, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to hopefully in the new year going to some conferences and meeting some users and talking to them about their VS Code Python experience.
Yeah.
I also just like love attending the talks and like hearing what people are working on, and I think it's just a good way to get connected to the community. And, I think programming people think about it sometimes and they're just like, it's just me and my computer. It's like, no, but there's like a whole world of people out there.
Right. Somebody designed that thing you're using.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk. Yeah, I just can't wait to, do social things again.
Have you done any talks at a conference before?
No, not yet, but it is on my it's like on my goals.
Okay.
Of like speaking at an upcoming conference. So I only had the opportunity of attending PyCascades back in, was that February, March? I can't remember.
Okay.
But in Portland, and that was super awesome to talk to some folks.
Yeah, I talked to some of the organizers of that.
Yeah, I think I met David from Real Python there.
Oh, David Amos, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
That's who provided me the question I asked you earlier.
Oh,
about type checking.
Oh wow. Yeah, I'm new to types in Python too, so
Yeah. Well, it's kind of crazy. It's just like the more I talk to people, the more they kind of come up. And, I was talking to Łukasz Langa, the release manager for Python 3.9, and obviously that went down some of that path also, which was very interesting.
Yeah.
And I did like my own video course on type checking. And so it was like, it kind of became this like theme for a while, but I feel like it's, definitely as a beginner and getting into Python over the last several years, it's not something that's required, but the more that you're going to share code and it's going to interact with other things, and then seeing the advantages that, that it can provide through the tools that we've talked about throughout this whole episode, you can kind of start to see, okay, well, yeah, there's some, some big advantages to it. And, it's just, it's such a language that can be used in so many different ways. And so some of the ways you may not need this, but in many other ways, especially if you're going to integrate your code with other things, it's almost like a form of documentation, that is important to show intent,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just like, expresses intentionality. And I think, it also kind of serves as a form of living documentation.
Yeah.
Like I feel like people, this is also a contentious topic, but, people love to, argue about how many comments or how commented code should be. But at least if it's like, in type annotations or something, then like you're forced to kind of keep it up to date. Otherwise you're going to have a bad time.
Right.
So I think that's kind of helpful for sure. But yeah, it'll be interesting to kind of see where the community heads with this in the next couple of years. But yeah, I feel like lots of people are talking about it right now.
Yeah. The other question I have is, what are you interested in learning next?
So I've recently found the world of physical computing, like Arduinos and Raspberry Pis. And
oh, cool.
Yeah, so I do grad school part-time. I'm almost done. And I'm doing it in like, kind of like, well, the field is called human-centered design and engineering. But what that boils down to is kind of like user experience. But last quarter, I had the opportunity to take a class that was all about like design for the Internet of Things.
Yeah.
And so I have spent a bunch of time playing around with a feather huzzah, doing stuff in C++, or not C. Well, it's kind of like C++. It's Arduino. It's not really C++, but
yeah, it's their IDE, right?
Oh, and it's brutal. I miss. This is where I am the person that wants the bells and whistles. I want completions. I want syntax highlighting. I want, but.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I took a feather huzzah and I was like, I'm going to put Python on this and I'm going to try and use it. And the prof didn't want me to do that. So we were trying to stay in the Arduino realm. So I had played around a little bit with MicroPython, but I'm really excited about learning about CircuitPython right now.
Yeah.
And I'd love to get my hands on like a circuit playground, which is super cool because I think like a lot of like the really basic components are built into the board, which is kind of nice, especially if like you're starting out and you're trying to learn how to like wire up an LED or like stuff like that. So I think that's probably next on my list of like Python things to learn.
Yeah. Adafruit is
the best.
They have so many, they have so many great tools. And I had Thea Flowers on and she's been making these audio projects that kind of combine a lot of that stuff, which has been really kind of fun. And I still haven't wired my up. I need to get what's called a Euro rack it's because it's like a little synthesizer.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. And the idea that I could program it and make my own little sampler and stuff. And yeah, it's definitely one of my own little hobbies. And I did a Arduino course for real Python. That was kind of fun. And it was more connected though. You're installing an additional library to be able to remotely control it. You still have to have your computer connected, but the idea of like moving on to like standalone things where you just plug in the device and the code files right there, is pretty amazing to be able to edit in just raw Python.
Yeah.
So yeah, cool.
Yeah. I think it's also like, I was in this class with a bunch of folks who were non-engineers and they had no programming experience and they were thrown into like Arduino language and they were like, what is this? Like how like this is like a lot. Whereas I think like, starting out in that like space using Python is just like a lot more approachable. Like it's a lot more readable. You don't have to like deal with types if you don't want to, you know what I mean? So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This was super fun.
I want to thank Savannah Ostrowski for coming on the podcast. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast in your favorite player. And if you like the show, leave us a 5-star rating and a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.